Nathan Salmon, perhaps inspired by Plantinga, in the later article, Salmon says, quote, "Let us name the possible individual who would have developed from the union of sperm S and egg E, if S had fertilized E in the normal manner. No man. No man does not exist in the actual world, but there are many possible worlds in which he, or perhaps it, does exist." So I think that the term no man does not mean the individual who would have developed from the union of sperm S and egg E. That's not what it means. To see why I say this, consider the following speech. So I'm going to give a speech. Here goes. Let S star and E star be the sperm and egg whose union actually resulted in Alvin Plantinga. There are distant possible worlds, however, in which the union of S star and E star results in someone else. Similarly, there are distant worlds in which the union of S and E results in someone other than no man. As a result, there are worlds in which no man is not the individual who would have developed from S and E. Nevertheless, in all the nearest worlds in which S and E unite, no man is the result. Thus, if S and E had united, no man would have been the result. Now, that little speech I just gave might contain some falsehoods. Maybe you think it contains some necessary falsehoods because you have a certain view about essentiality of origins, but the speech doesn't contain any contradictions. The speech would contain a contradiction, however, if the expression no man meant the individual who would have resulted from S and E. In particular, the claim that there are worlds in which no man is not the individual who would have developed from S and E would be contradictory. So I say no man, because there's no contradiction in that speech, does not mean the individual who would have developed from S and E. More generally, the name no man, the term no man, is not a disguised description of any sort. And the sentence, quote, no man does not exist, certainly seems to express a proposition about no man. I conclude that the sentence, no man does not exist, expresses a singular proposition about no man, namely the proposition that no man does not exist. All of this leads to the second argument against the received view. This is also on your handout. A, premise, no man does not exist. B, if no man does not exist, then the proposition that no man does not exist is true. C, that no man does not exist is true. That follows from A and B. D, if a proposition is true, then that proposition exists. E, the proposition that no man does not exist exists. That follows from C and D. F, if a proposition exists and has constituents, then its constituents exist. G, if the received view is true, then no man is a constituent of the proposition that no man does not exist. Therefore, I, the received view, is false. It's from A and H. This argument is not subject to any objection from eternalism, but one might raise other objections to this argument. Some of those objections are or easily turned into objections to the argument of the previous section, as well as to that of the following. But this section's argument does make one assumption that those other two arguments do not. For consider G. If the received view is true, then no man is a constituent of the proposition that no man does not exist. That's what G says. G presupposes that the proposition that no man does not exist is a singular proposition, and so is about a particular individual. This in turn presupposes that there is a fact of the matter about which particular individual would have resulted from the union of S and E. Some may object that there is no such fact of the matter. They might compare no man unfavorably with Quine's that possible bald man in the doorway. And so they reject a crucial presupposition of G. This rejection gives them a reason to reject G itself. And of course, anyone who rejects G should reject any argument that has G as a premise, including my argument above. Presumably, defenders of this objection will deny that there are any true counterfactuals to the effect that had some event occurred that did not occur, then a certain individual would have existed who never has existed or never will exist. Otherwise, we could recast the argument above so that it involves some non-existent entity other than no man, an entity that would have existed had such and such occurred. But I think there are some true counterfactuals of the relevant sort. In particular, I think that if there had been a union of S and E, then a particular individual would have resulted. And so I endorse the aforementioned presuppositions of G and indeed G itself. More to the point, I think that the argument of this section is sound, and so in part because of that argument, I reject the received view. Moreover, I'll present one more variation on this argument, which relies on neither the truth of the sort of counterfactuals just discussed, nor the falsity of eternalism. Section 4, argument 3, possibly true, negative existential singular propositions. Alvin Plantinga is contingent. Possibly he fails to have ever existed. Thus, my third argument against the received view. Premise 1, possibly Plantinga does not exist. 2, necessarily, if Plantinga does not exist, then the proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true. 3, possibly that Plantinga does not exist is true. That's from 1 and 2. 4, necessarily, if a proposition is true, then that proposition exists. 5, possibly the proposition that Plantinga does not exist exists and is true. 6, necessarily if a proposition exists and has constituents, then its constituents exist. 7, necessarily if the received view is true, then Plantinga is a constituent of the proposition that Plantinga does not exist. 8, if the received view is true, then possibly that Plantinga does not exist exists and is true, and Plantinga exists. That follows from 5, 6, and 7. 9, necessarily if Plantinga exists, then the proposition that Plantinga does not exist is false. Therefore, 10, the received view is false from 8 and 9. The above argument closely resembles an argument that Al himself defends in this 1983 paper on existentialism. And objections to Plantinga's argument suggest objections to the above argument. For example, in light of his reply to Plantinga's argument, I'm sure that Williamson would turn the above argument on his head, just as some eternalists turn the argument section 2 on its head. That is, Williamson would argue that because the received view is true, premise 1, possibly Plantinga does not exist, is false. Indeed, Williamson explicitly argues that because the received view is true, every existing entity exists necessarily. Williamson tries to make this result plausible. Nevertheless, in my opinion, the claim that you and I and Alvin Plantinga and everything else exists necessarily is not plausible. At the very least, that claim is much less plausible than the denial of the received view. So I think it's a mistake to turn the above argument on its head. Some defenders of the received view will say that if Plantinga did not exist, then the proposition that Plantinga does not exist would not exist, and so would not be true. These defenders of the received view will deny the premise of the above argument too. Necessarily, if Plantinga does not exist, then the proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true. They might also attempt to accommodate the intuitions that seem to support 2. 2 seems pretty intuitive. The standard attempt turns on the distinction between truth in a world and truth at a world. To understand this distinction, let's turn to an example offered by Plantinga. Here's the example from Al. So probably would be bad to object to this example at this venue. The sentence token, quote, no sentence tokens exist, actually correctly describes how things would be if a world in which there are no sentence tokens were actual. We can articulate this point in terms of truth at a world as follows, and this is star on your handout. The sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is true at all worlds in which no sentence tokens exist. Of course, if a world in which no sentence tokens exist had been actual, then no sentence tokens would have existed. And so no sentence tokens would have been true. And so the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, would not have been true. We can articulate this point in terms of truth in a world, and this is double star on your handout. The sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is not true in any world in which no sentence tokens exist. Star and double star illustrate the distinction with respect to sentence tokens between truth at a world and truth in a world. Some think that that same distinction holds with respect to propositions, Adams and Fine, for example. Suppose they deny 2, then they deny that the proposition that Plantinga does not exist is true in worlds in which Al does not exist. But they will add that the proposition that Plantinga does not exist actually correctly describes how things would be if such a world were actual. So they will endorse X. That Plantinga does not exist is true at, and this is on your handout, at all worlds in which Plantinga does not exist. Those who reject 2 but endorse X are likely to think that the intuitions that seem to lead to 2 can be accommodated by X. That seems to be the whole point of truth at a world. They will thus think that X makes the denial of 2 more plausible than it would otherwise be. But I'm going to argue that, on the contrary, X itself actually leads to 2. I begin this argument by considering triple star on your handout. Necessarily, if no sentence tokens exist, then the proposition that no sentence tokens exist is true. I think triple star is true, and defenders of the received view agree, or they should agree. After all, defenders of the received view typically grant that general, that is non-singular propositions exist necessarily. So they grant that the proposition that no sentence tokens exist exists necessarily, and so they grant that it exists in worlds without sentence tokens. And surely if it exists in those worlds, it's true in those worlds. Moreover, I think not only that triple star is true, but also that triple star's truth explains the truth of, go back to single star. The sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is true at all worlds in which no sentence tokens exist. Indeed, it would be bizarre if the proposition actually expressed by the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, were true in a possible world, but that this did not explain why the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, were true at that world. Conversely, I think that if the proposition actually expressed by the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is not true in a world, then the sentence token, no sentence tokens exist, is not true at